In his dreadful lassitude and objectless rage, Cobain seemed to have given wearied voice to the despondency of the generation that had come after history, whose every move was anticipated, tracked, bought and sold, before it had even appeared. Cobain knew that he was just another piece of a spectacle, that nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV, knew that his every move was a cliché scripted in advance, knew that even realizing it is a cliché. Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism. I shouldn't pretend that the consensus itself was any of my concern. It was absurd and slightly despicable in the first decade of Thatcher and Reagan to hear former and actual radicals intone piously against the politics of confrontation. I suppose that if this collection has a point, it is the desire of one individual to see the idea of confrontation kept alive. Christopher Hitchens. Our freedom of choice in a competitive society rests on the fact that if one person refuses to satisfy our wishes, we can turn to another. But if we face a monopolist, we are at his absolute mercy. Friedrich von Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. The rise of neoliberalism coincided with and accelerated the disappearance of the working class as a political force across the world. With the decline of the traditional industries, such as coal mining, shipbuilding, and steel production, the economies of the West became increasingly service-orientated and outsourced manufacturing to developing countries. Instead of being related to economic production, class is now more associated with the places where you live or grew up in. Think, for example, of the metonym Red Wall to describe working-class voters in the north of England who traditionally voted Labour. Class, in this conception, is conceived of as a historical legacy, particular to areas that used to be home to industry. It hasn't gone away, however. Instead, class today can be characterised by precariousness. Or rather, what we see is class characterised as precarious in the private sector and essential in both private and public. The precariat are temporary, so-called casual workers on short-term and zero-hours contracts. In jobs such as these, bargaining power is exceptionally limited because 1. They aren't around long enough to make their continued presence indispensable, and 2. Often they are relying on the goodwill of the employer to offer them shifts, so self-interest dictates that they don't make demands. Essential workers have related problems. For example, while there is a public cult of the NHS, the near-government monopoly on provision of healthcare means that essentially they get what they are given, and there's nowhere to go except abroad if they want alternative employment. Because class conflict is effectively suppressed in these economic conditions, resentment directs itself into other channels, such as intergenerational strife, where the boomers are blamed for society's problems. Another manifestation of the displacement of class struggle in so-called post-industrial society is in the concept of resistance. The rallying call of the ostensibly politically powerless is pushback against a malevolent regime. In this model, initiative always originates from the state or the corporation, and the only thing we can do is react, either by rejection or calling for modification. Through this, people are relegated to a sort of permanent opposition. Neoliberal ideology tends to frame the politically contentious in terms of equality and inclusion. It is obsessed with increasing representation of historically maligned groups, women, ethnic minorities, LGBT people. This in practice means their participation in the free market economy and not social liberation. What needs to be understood is that class is the only viable tool we can use to challenge socioeconomic inequality. The problem with class, however, is that it is by its nature contentious. Everyone can agree that racism is bad, sexism is archaic, and homophobia irrational. There is a consensus. It's common sense. Class, however, implies conflict because it is socially constructed and hence capable of reconstitution by political action in a way that the existence of sex, phenotypical diversity, and sexualities cannot. The latter, while undoubtedly shaped by legislative frameworks and funding, are mostly cultural issues. One of the defining characteristics of the neoliberal era has been the narrow parameters of the politically possible within the strict rules of supranational organisations such as the IMF, World Bank, and especially the European Union. This is particularly illustrated by the case of Greece following the 2008 financial crash, which had punitive austerity imposed on it by the Commission, despite the decisive rejection of such measures by the populace in a referendum. While whole countries are politically immobilised by prohibitions on nationalisation and an inability to prevent the undercutting of labour costs by cheap imported workers, businesses are increasingly agile and even transient. A response to the decline of the high street, caused by a combination of online shopping and a neglect of public spaces, has been the rise of so-called pop-up culture. These temporary businesses appear and disappear so quickly that they have minimal social obligations, responding to consumer fads rather than genuine need. Neoliberal culture is permeated with impermanence, and yet people are expected to be always on, ready to take the next delivery, or to turn one's house into a hotel with one click. Because it is likely that your job is just a temporary stop on a career path that might see you change employers every other year, why bother joining a union? Isn't it easier just to keep your head down, say nothing, and put up with the small injustices, to keep in your boss's good graces? This is increasingly the conclusion of workers in the West, whose trade union membership has steadily declined since its peak in the 1980s. The character of unions themselves has changed too, with confrontation ditched in favour of cooperation and a focus on productivity, improving the workplace for both employer and employee. Trade unions now value good management over genuine worker participation in and control of workplaces. This is a trend across mainstream political organisations who have turned away from democracy to technocracy in a shift towards problem solving rather than policy conflict. Problems arising from weak unions are compounded by high staff turnover in a way that ensures exploitation persists.